My wife cheated on me with her guitar teacher. My wife, Lisa, and I have been married for 5 years. It hasn't always been perfect, whose marriage is, but we've been solid, or so I thought. She's beautiful, passionate, and stubborn as hell. She dives into new hobbies like a kid at a candy store. Pottery, yoga, painting, you name it, she's given it a go. So, when she told me she wanted to learn the guitar, it didn't seem strange. If anything, I thought it was just another hobby to add to her ever-growing list. She seemed genuinely excited about it. She bought this cherry red acoustic guitar, which she proudly displayed in our living room, right next to her half-finished canvas from her short-lived painting phase. She even signed up for lessons with some local instructor, Scott. She talked about how patient he was, how he made learning fun. I was happy for her. I even teased her, calling her Rockstar Lisa, and she'd laugh it off, pretending to strum the guitar like a pro. It felt like a cute little chapter in our life. But things started changing after a few weeks. At first, Lisa would go to lessons once a week. Then, suddenly, she needed extra sessions, 2 a week, sometimes even 3. She always had a reason. Scott says I'm catching on fast and doesn't want me to lose momentum. Or, I need more time to practice chord transitions. At first, I didn't think much of it. She'd even send me pictures before leaving, her holding the guitar strap, pouting dramatically like a wannabe rock star. It was funny, and I'd play along, texting her back with, "Don't forget me when you're famous." But over time, things felt off. For one, she never practiced at home. That beautiful guitar, which she'd been so excited about, was starting to collect dust. I even pointed it out once, jokingly. "How's a rock star supposed to rise to fame without practicing?" I asked. She rolled her eyes and said, "I practice plenty during my lessons, babe. I don't want to drive you crazy strumming here all night." Okay, fair enough, I thought. Except she didn't seem to be improving at all. I'm no expert, but even I know the difference between a G chord and someone awkwardly plucking random strings. Once, when I asked her to play something for me, she got flustered and said she wasn't ready yet. "I'll play for you when I'm really good. Just wait," she promised. So I waited. And waited. Things got even weirder when her lessons started running later and later. "Scott and I got carried away talking about music," she'd say, or, "We grabbed coffee after the lesson to discuss some cool theory stuff." I'd nod, trying to be supportive. I even started teasing her about her guitar nerd crush on Scott, to which she'd always laugh and say, "Yeah, right. You're the only man in my life." But then there were the mood swings. Some days, Lisa would come home glowing, talking about how fun the lesson was. Other times, she seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. She'd wave off my questions, saying she was just tired or had a lot on her mind. I chalked it up to stress and didn't push her. After all, I was busy too. My job in tech has me working long hours, and I wasn't exactly Mr. Attentive husband lately. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe this was all in my head. Then came last Thursday. Lisa had left for one of her extra lessons, and I was cleaning up after dinner when her phone buzzed on the counter. Normally, I wouldn't even glance at it. We've always been open about our phones, same passcodes, no secrets. But this notification caught my attention. It was a message from someone named Scott Guitar. The preview said, "Can't wait to see you. Last time was amazing winking face. My stomach dropped. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Scott was just an overly friendly guy with a weird sense of humor. But something in me, it wasn't even suspicion, more like instinct, compelled me to unlock her phone. Her passcode is my birthday, so it wasn't hard. What I found, I can't unsee it. Their conversation was filled with messages that were not about guitar lessons. There were inside jokes, flirtatious comments, and explicit details about what they'd done together. They weren't meeting for extra lessons, they were meeting for each other. The cherry on top? Lisa's last message to him. "I'll tell him I'm running late again. Can't wait to feel your hands on me." I felt sick. My legs went weak, and I had to sit down before I collapsed right there in the kitchen. My mind raced. How long had this been going on? Was it just a fling, or something deeper? Was I stupid for not noticing earlier? Every extra lesson, every late-night coffee, it was all a lie. And here I was, cheering her on like a fool, thinking she was chasing some innocent passion. The worst part? She walked in the door an hour later, smiling and acting like nothing was wrong. She even kissed me on the cheek and asked how my day was, like she hadn't just been doing God knows what with Scott. I stood there, frozen, trying to act normal, my heart pounding so hard I thought she might hear it. I haven't confronted her yet. I don't know how. Part of me wants to scream at her, demand answers, throw her out of the house. But another part of me doesn't want it to be real. Because if it is, if she's really been cheating, then everything we've built, our home, our marriage, our future, is a lie. For now, I'm sitting here in the dark, typing this out, hoping that writing it down will make it feel less suffocating. I don't know what my next move is. All I know is that the woman I thought I knew is a stranger, and the life I thought we had is gone. The morning started the same way it always did, Lisa up before me, humming some tune while she made coffee. She looked normal, happy even. I sat at the table, watching her move around the kitchen like nothing had changed, like she hadn't just spent last night lying to my face while sneaking off to be with someone else. It was almost impressive how effortlessly she wore her mask, as though guilt was something that didn't apply to her. She slid a mug in front of me, flashing that easy smile she'd perfected over the years. "Big plans for today?" she asked, sipping her coffee and leaning against the counter. I shrugged, keeping my eyes on the steaming mug. "Not much. Just catching up on some work." "You work too much," she said, half laughing as she grabbed her phone. I watched her casually scroll, probably texting him, while I pretended to be engrossed in my drink. The urge to grab the phone, to confront her right then and there, bubbled up in my chest, but I forced it down. Not yet. Not until I had everything I needed. After she left for her so-called lesson, I sat in the silence of the house, trying to figure out my next move. Mark had sent me more updates that morning, photos of Lisa and Scott from earlier in the week, walking hand in hand through a park. They looked comfortable, like this wasn't just some fling but something deeper. It was a punch to the gut every time I saw their faces together. How long had this been going on? Did she even feel guilty? Or was I just a placeholder, someone to keep the house running while she lived a double life? I texted Mark, asking for a detailed summary of the evidence he'd gathered so far. Within an hour, he sent me a file packed with time-stamped photos, locations, and even a few audio clips he'd managed to capture of their conversations. Listening to them was like ripping off a bandage repeatedly. The way she laughed with Scott, the soft tone she used when she spoke to him. It was the same way she used to talk to me. There was one clip in particular that broke me. Lisa's voice, light and teasing, saying, "I can't keep lying to him forever. I hate feeling like this." Hate feeling like this? The irony was almost unbearable. When she got home that evening, I could barely look at her. She greeted me with the same cheerful energy, plopping down on the couch next to me and pulling out her phone. I mumbled something about needing to finish a project and headed upstairs. I couldn't sit next to her without feeling my skin crawl. She didn't even notice. Up in my office, I stared at the file on my computer, my cursor hovering over the folder labeled Evidence. My mind raced. What was I waiting for? Every second I let this go on, every second I pretended everything was fine, felt like a betrayal to myself. But I wasn't just angry, I was hurt, confused. This wasn't just some random woman, this was Lisa. The woman I'd vowed to love and protect. The woman who promised me the same. How did we get here? That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Lisa's steady breathing beside me. The same questions looped in my head. Was I not enough? Did I miss the signs? Could I have stopped this from happening? Every answer felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I turned over, watching her sleep, and for a moment, I felt a pang of something close to sadness. She looked so peaceful, so normal. Like the woman I thought I married. But then the image of her with Scott flashed in my mind, and the sadness burned away, replaced by something darker. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep playing the oblivious husband. It was eating me alive. But I also couldn't go into this blindly. If I was going to confront her, I needed to be prepared for whatever she'd throw at me. Because knowing Lisa, she wasn't just going to admit to it. She'd deny, deflect, maybe even try to turn it around on me. No, I needed to be ready for anything. While she was out running errands, I called Mark and asked him to wrap things up. "I've got more than enough now," he said, his tone confident. "If you're ready to confront her, I can send you the final file tonight." "Send it," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. When the file came through later that evening, I couldn't bring myself to open it right away. I sat at my desk, staring at the email notification, my hands trembling. This was it. Once I opened this file, there was no going back. Everything would be laid bare, the lies, the betrayal, the double life she'd been leading. I took a deep breath and clicked. Photos of them together filled my screen. Hotel parking lots, parks, coffee shops. Her car parked outside his house late at night. There were texts too, hundreds of them, each one more damning than the last. But the worst part was the audio recordings. In one, Lisa told Scott, "I feel more alive with you than I have in years." My stomach churned. In another, she laughed and said, "He'd never suspect. He's too wrapped up in his own world." I slammed my laptop shut, my breathing ragged. That was enough. I couldn't take any more. When Lisa walked in the door that night, I was ready. I'd rehearsed what I was going to say over and over in my head. I pictured her reaction 100 different ways: denial, anger, tears. But none of it mattered. All I knew was that I couldn't keep pretending. She looked up from her phone and smiled at me. "Hey, babe. You okay? You look tense." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "Lisa," I said, my voice cold and steady, "we need to talk." Her smile faltered, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. She knew. Lisa sat down across from me at the dining table, her eyes narrowing slightly, betraying a flicker of uncertainty. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice carefully measured, like she was already bracing for something but didn't know what. I reached into my laptop bag, pulling out a file folder that Mark had delivered earlier that day. I placed it on the table and slid it toward her without a word. She hesitated before opening it, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were photos, clear, undeniable evidence of her affair with Scott. Pictures of them walking hand in hand, laughing together at a park, and the most damning of all, a shot of them embracing in front of a hotel entrance. She flipped through the images, her breathing growing uneven, her face pale as the blood drained from it. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked up at me, her eyes darting between my face and the photos, like she was trying to gauge how much I knew. I don't know what this is," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Don't lie to me, Lisa," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. I was gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. "I've been watching you. I know about the hotels. I know about Scott. I know about all of it." Her breath hitched, and she put a hand to her mouth, like she was trying to physically stop herself from speaking. For a moment, there was silence, thick and suffocating. Then, she snapped the folder shut and pushed it away as if that could erase everything it contained. "It's not what you think," she said quickly, her words spilling out in a rush. "Scott and he's been going through a rough time, and I've been trying to help him. It's nothing, I swear." "Nothing?" I repeated, my voice rising. I pulled my laptop closer, opened it, and clicked on an audio file Mark had sent me. Lisa's voice filled the room. "I can't keep lying to him forever," she said in the recording, her tone soft but unmistakably guilty. "I hate feeling like this." Her eyes widened as the words echoed through the room. "Turn it off," she whispered, her voice cracking. Please, just turn it off. I closed the laptop, but the damage was already done. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms as I stared at her. So, do you want to tell me what that was about? Or should I keep playing them? Lisa shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said finally, her voice barely audible. It just got out of hand. Got out of hand? I repeated, my tone dripping with disbelief. You didn't accidentally meet him at a hotel. You didn't accidentally lie to me for months. Those weren't accidents, Lisa. Those were choices. She flinched at my words, tears streaming down her face now. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, her voice breaking. I swear I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, I shot back. Over and over again. Every time you lied to me, every time you left this house pretending you were going to a lesson, you chose to hurt me. Her shoulders shook as she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I was lonely, she choked out. You're always working, always distracted. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. And Scott made you feel special, right? I said bitterly. He listened to you, paid attention to you. Is that it? Yes, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But it wasn't just that. I was unhappy. With us, with everything. And I didn't know how to fix it. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. So instead of talking to me, you decided to cheat? To sneak around with some guy and pretend like that was the solution? I didn't plan for this, she said desperately, standing too. I didn't wake up one day and decide to hurt you. It just happened. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Nothing just happens, Lisa. You didn't trip and fall into his arms. You made a choice. Over and over again. Her sobs grew louder, but I felt nothing. No pity, no compassion. Just anger and an overwhelming sense of loss. I love you, she said suddenly, her voice trembling. I know I messed up, but I love you. I never stopped loving you. Don't, I said coldly, holding up a hand to stop her. Don't say that. Because if you really loved me, you wouldn't have done this. She crumbled into the chair, her face buried in her hands. I don't know how to fix this, she whispered. Maybe you can't, I said simply, turning and walking out of the room. I didn't slam the door. I didn't need to. The sound of her crying was already loud enough. The days after the confrontation were a strange mix of clarity and chaos. Lisa stayed in the guest room, though she left the door open, like an unspoken invitation for a conversation I wasn't ready to have. I avoided her as much as possible. Every time I saw her, her puffy, red-rimmed eyes, her awkward, tentative movements, it only reminded me of the betrayal. It was like she was a ghost of the person I thought I married, haunting the house we built together. She tried to reach out in small, pathetic ways. She left little sticky notes in places I couldn't avoid, on the fridge, on the bathroom mirror, even on my laptop. I'm so sorry. I want to fix this. I'll wait for you. It made me furious. It was like she thought these cheap little apologies would somehow erase the mess she'd made of our lives. I threw every single one of them away. At work, I found myself unusually productive. Throwing myself into coding helped drown out the chaos. For hours at a time, I could forget that my wife had been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back. But as soon as I stepped into the house, the silence hit me like a brick wall. The quiet was so loud it was suffocating. I missed the noise of normalcy, Lisa cooking dinner, the sound of her guitar, even if she couldn't actually play, the mindless chatter about our days. I thought about leaving, just grabbing a bag and checking into a hotel. But something stopped me every time. Maybe it was the house itself, the memories tied to every room. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to give up the fight, even if it felt like the fight was already lost. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, Lisa cornered me in the living room. I was sprawled on the couch, pretending to watch TV, though I hadn't registered a single word of the show in front of me. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her hands ringing nervously, before she stepped inside. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice hesitant but steady. I didn't look at her. "About what?" "You know what," she said, moving closer. "Please, I need you to hear me out." I sighed, turning the TV off and sitting up. "Fine. Talk." She perched on the armrest of the chair across from me, her shoulders hunched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, her voice trembling. "About what I did. About how much I hurt you. And I know I can't take it back, but She stopped, choking on her words. "I just need you to understand why it happened." I felt the anger bubbling up again, hot and raw. "Why?" I snapped. "What possible explanation could you give that makes this okay? You were bored? Lonely? You've already said it all, Lisa. I don't want excuses." She flinched at the venom in my voice but didn't back down. "It's not an excuse," she said quietly. "I'm not trying to justify it. But I need you to know the truth. I was unhappy, Nate. I felt invisible. You're always working, always distracted. I didn't know how to tell you. And then Scott." She broke off, shaking her head. "He made me feel seen again. Like I mattered." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Seen? You mattered to me, Lisa. You mattered to me. But instead of talking to me, you ran off with someone else. Do you have any idea how that feels? To know you didn't even try to fix things before throwing it all away?" Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not anymore. "I know," she whispered. "I was selfish. I was stupid. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you to give me a chance to make this right." Her desperation hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. I stared at her, searching her face for something, guilt, sincerity, anything that could make this conversation feel less like a waste of time. "I don't know if I can," I said finally, my voice hollow. "I don't know if there's anything left to fix." Lisa covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed. I wanted to feel something, anger, sadness, pity, but all I felt was empty. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice muffled. "Counseling, therapy, anything you want. Just, please, Nate. Don't give up on us." I stood, unable to sit there a second longer. "I don't know what I want, Lisa. Not yet. But right now, I can't do this." I left her there in the living room, her sobs following me up the stairs like a shadow. The following days were excruciating. Lisa seemed determined to prove she meant what she'd said. She offered to sleep at her sister's place, give me space to figure things out, but I refused. I wasn't going to be the one who left our home, not when I was the one who'd been wronged. Instead, we lived like awkward roommates, moving around each other in tense silence. She tiptoed through the house like she was walking on eggshells. She kept her distance unless it was absolutely necessary to talk, about the kids, about groceries, about anything mundane that let her pretend life hadn't imploded. When she wasn't avoiding me, she was glued to her phone or buried in self-help books. I even saw her downloading a couples therapy app, though she didn't mention it to me. One night I caught her staring at our wedding photo on the mantel, tears streaming down her face. She didn't notice me standing there, and I didn't announce myself. I just watched her, feeling something twist painfully in my chest. She looked so broken, so unlike the confident, vibrant woman I married. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Work wasn't the refuge I hoped it would be either. My focus was gone, and my coworkers started noticing. "You okay, Nate?" my manager asked during a team meeting. I nodded quickly, brushing him off with some excuse about being tired. But I wasn't tired. I was exhausted, drained by the emotional roller coaster I hadn't signed up for. One night, I stayed late at the office, not because I had work to finish, but because I couldn't face going home. I sat in the empty break room, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself. That's when I saw it, a text from Lisa. "I know you're hurting, and I know I caused it. I just want to say I'm sorry again. I miss us. I miss you. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. What was I supposed to say to that? That I missed her too? That I wanted to believe things could go back to normal? I didn't reply. I just turned off my phone and stared out the window, watching the city lights blur through the tears I refused to let fall. The kids were the only bright spot in the mess. I threw myself into being a dad, making sure they felt as little of the tension as possible. I took them to the park, helped with their homework, even let them stay up late watching movies on the weekends. Lisa joined us sometimes, but it always felt forced, like she was trying too hard to act like the mother she'd been before. One afternoon, my daughter, Emma, climbed onto my lap and looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes. "Are you mad at Mommy?" she asked, her voice small. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. "Why do you ask that, sweetie?" She shrugged, twirling a lock of her hair around her finger. "You don't talk to her like you used to. And she cries a lot." I didn't know what to say. How do you explain something like this to a child? "Mommy and I are just going through a tough time," I said finally, stroking her hair. "But we both love you and your brother very much, okay? That's never going to change." She nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She hugged me tightly, and I held on to her like she was the only solid thing in my crumbling world. That night, I sat on the couch long after the kids had gone to bed, my mind racing. I hated this limbo we were in, this constant state of pretending everything was fine for the sake of appearances. Lisa passed by on her way to the kitchen, hesitating when she saw me. "Do you want to talk?" she asked softly, standing awkwardly by the doorway. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to tell her no, to keep punishing her with my silence. But another part of me, maybe the part that still loved her, despite everything, wanted to hear what she had to say. "Fine," I said finally, gesturing for her to sit down. She perched on the edge of the couch, wringing her hands nervously. "I've been trying to figure out what I can do to fix this," she began. "I know it's not going to be easy, and I know I've already broken your trust, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Her words sounded rehearsed, like she'd been practicing them in the mirror, but there was a rawness in her voice that made me pause. "And what if it's not fixable?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She flinched, but she didn't back down. "Then I'll keep trying anyway," she said firmly. "Because I'm not ready to give up on us. I don't care how long it takes." I leaned back, studying her. She looked desperate, yes, but there was also a determination in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. For the first time in weeks, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this mess. "I don't know what I want yet," I admitted, my voice softer now. "But if you're serious about fixing this, you have to prove it. Words aren't enough anymore." She nodded quickly, tears brimming in her eyes. "I'll prove it," she promised. "I'll do whatever it takes." I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to. Instead, I stood and walked upstairs, leaving her alone in the quiet of the living room. Lisa's efforts to prove herself began almost immediately. The next morning, I found a note on the counter next to a cup of freshly brewed coffee. "I've scheduled us a session with a marriage counselor. Friday at 6 p.m. I hope you'll come." I stared at the note for a long time, the smell of coffee filling the kitchen. Counseling. It was a logical step, but the idea of sitting in a room, airing out our dirty laundry to a stranger, made my skin crawl. Still, part of me admired her boldness. She wasn't waiting for me to make the first move. When Friday came, I found myself standing outside a cozy little office building downtown, the evening sun casting long shadows on the pavement. Lisa was already there, waiting on the steps, clutching her purse like it was a lifeline. She gave me a tentative smile when she saw me. "You came," she said, her voice tinged with relief. "I said I'd think about it," I replied. "That doesn't mean I'm all in." Her face fell slightly, but she nodded, leading the way inside. The counselor, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Carver, greeted us with a warm smile and an office that smelled like lavender and old books. She asked us to sit on a cushy couch while she took a seat across from us, clipboard in hand. So, she began, her tone gentle but direct. Why don't we start with why you're here? Lisa looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I stayed silent. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. After a long pause, she took a deep breath and spoke. I made a terrible mistake, she said, her voice trembling. I betrayed Nate. I hurt him, and I broke our marriage. I'm here because I want to fix it, because I want to be a better person for him and for our family. Dr. Carver nodded, scribbling something on her clipboard before turning to me. Nate, how does that make you feel? I scoffed, leaning back against the couch. How do you think it makes me feel? Betrayed. Angry. Humiliated. Lisa flinched at my words, tears pooling in her eyes, but I wasn't done. She didn't just hurt me. She destroyed the trust we built over years. And now she expects me to just believe her when she says she wants to fix it? I don't expect that, Lisa said quickly, her voice breaking. I know I have to earn it back, and I know it won't happen overnight. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes, Nate. I just need you to give me a chance. Dr. Carver held up a hand, signaling for both of us to pause. Rebuilding trust is one of the hardest things a couple can do after betrayal, she said. But it's not impossible. It starts with honesty and a willingness to communicate, even when it's uncomfortable. The session was intense, to say the least. Dr. Carver guided us through a series of questions, forcing us to confront things we'd been avoiding for years. Lisa admitted she'd felt neglected, invisible, like I cared more about work than her. I countered by pointing out that I worked long hours to provide for our family, not because I didn't love her. By the end of the hour, we were both emotionally drained. Dr. Carver gave us homework, write letters to each other explaining what we wanted from our marriage moving forward. Lisa thanked her profusely as we left, while I stayed quiet, still unsure if this was the right path. The drive home was silent, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. When we pulled into the driveway, Lisa hesitated before getting out of the car. Thank you for coming, she said softly. I nodded, my hand on the door handle. Don't thank me yet. One session doesn't change what you did. Her face crumpled, but she nodded, stepping out and heading inside without another word. That night, I sat in my office, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The idea of writing Lisa a letter felt ridiculous. What could I say that I hadn't already screamed at her during the confrontation? Still, I picked up the pen, letting my thoughts spill out in jagged, uneven lines. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. I don't know if I even want to. But part of me still loves you. And that's the part one hate the most. I stared at the words for a long time, then crumpled the paper and tossed it in the trash. Lisa's light was still on when I passed her door on my way to bed. For a moment, I considered knocking, handing her the letter, starting the conversation. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, one question kept running through my mind: was this worth saving? The next morning, Lisa left early to take the kids to her parents' house. She'd offered to give me the day alone, saying it might help me clear my head. I wasn't sure if it was a genuine act of consideration or her attempt to avoid more awkward silences, but I didn't care. The quiet house felt like a relief, a momentary escape from the weight pressing down on me. I spent the day wandering aimlessly through the house. Every room felt like a trap, filled with memories I couldn't avoid. The dining room table where we'd hosted dinners with friends, the couch where we used to binge-watch shows together, even the damn coffee machine Lisa insisted we splurge on, it all mocked me with its normalcy. How could everything look the same when it was so broken? By mid-afternoon, I finally sat down at my desk to tackle the homework Dr. Carver had assigned. I stared at the blank page in front of me, the pen resting heavily in my hand. What was I supposed to say? That I missed her? That I hated her? That I felt both of those things at the same time, and it was tearing me apart? After what felt like hours, I started writing. Lisa, I don't even know where to begin. You broke something in me, something I don't know how to fix. I trusted you. I believed in you. And now, I don't know what's real anymore. Was our marriage ever as solid as I thought it was? Were you ever happy, or have you been pretending this whole time? You keep saying you want to fix this, but how can you fix something when the foundation is gone? When the trust is gone? I don't know if I can ever forgive you. I don't know if I even want to. But part of me still loves you. And that's the part one hate the most. I'm trying, Lisa. I don't know what the future looks like, but I'm trying. I set the pen down and read over the letter, my chest tightening with every word. It felt raw, unfinished, but it was the truth. I folded it carefully, slipping it into an envelope, and left it on the kitchen counter. When Lisa came home that evening, she found me in the living room, absently scrolling through my phone. She looked tired, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes when she noticed the envelope waiting for her. "Is this?" she asked, holding it up. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she disappeared into the guest room, shutting the door softly behind her. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. I tried to focus on the TV, but my mind kept drifting to her. What would she think of the letter? Would it give her hope, or crush it? When she finally emerged, her eyes were red, and her hands clutched the letter like it was the most fragile thing in the world. She sat down across from me, silent for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For being honest. For sharing how you feel, even if it's hard to hear." I nodded again, still unsure of what to say. "I wrote one for you, too," she added, pulling a folded piece of paper from her pocket. She hesitated before handing it to me. "I don't expect you to read it now, but when you're ready." I stared at the paper in my hand, the weight of her words settling over me. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I slipped it into my pocket and nodded toward the kids' bedrooms. "You should check on them. Emma was asking for you earlier." She gave me a small, sad smile and headed upstairs. I sat there, turning the letter over in my hands, debating whether or not I wanted to read it. After a long moment, I unfolded it and began. "Nate, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. What I did was selfish, cruel, and thoughtless. I hurt you in ways I can't even fully comprehend, and I hate myself for it. You keep asking why I did it, and I don't have a simple answer. I wish I did. I wish I could tell you there was one thing, one moment that pushed me into Scott's arms, but it wasn't like that. It was a slow unraveling, a series of little things that made me feel like I was disappearing. And instead of coming to you, instead of fighting for us, I ran. I betrayed you. And I'll regret that for the rest of my life. I don't know if I can ever fix what I broke. But I promise you this, I will spend every day trying. Even if it's too late. Even if you never forgive me. Because you're worth it. We're worth it." I set the letter down, my hands trembling. Her words felt genuine, but they didn't erase the pain. They didn't undo the betrayal. And yet, something about them softened the wall I'd built around myself. I didn't know what to say to her. I didn't know if there was anything left to say. So, I folded the letter and tucked it into my desk drawer, letting it sit there like an unresolved question. That night, for the first time in weeks, I lay awake wondering if forgiveness was possible. The days following the letters were a slow, painstaking crawl forward. It was like trying to rebuild a sandcastle after a storm had washed it away, messy, frustrating, and uncertain. Lisa threw herself into trying to fix things, not in big, dramatic ways, but in small, deliberate actions. She made sure the kids were taken care of, cooked meals she knew I liked, and even started cleaning the garage, a chore I'd been putting off for months. I didn't thank her for any of it. I wasn't sure if it was out of spite or simply because I didn't know how to react to her attempts. Every act of kindness felt loaded, like an unspoken plea for forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't something I could just hand out like a receipt. When Saturday rolled around, Lisa suggested taking the kids to the park. "They've been cooped up all week," she said, her voice careful and measured, like she was trying not to upset me. "It could be good for all of us to get out of the house for a while." I hesitated, my gut reaction leaning towards saying no. But then Emma appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide and hopeful. Can we go, Daddy? Please? I couldn't say no to her. Fine, I said, trying to sound casual. But don't expect me to stay long. The drive to the park was awkward, at least for me. The kids were in the back seat, chattering excitedly about the playground, while Lisa sat silently beside me, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I could feel her sneaking glances at me, but I kept my eyes on the road, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of meeting her gaze. The park was buzzing with life when we arrived. Families were scattered across the grass, kids ran back and forth between the swings and the slides, and a group of teenagers was playing frisbee near the picnic tables. For a moment, I felt a strange sense of normalcy, like this was just another Saturday before everything fell apart. We found a spot near the playground and laid out a blanket. The kids bolted toward the swings, laughing and yelling, while Lisa and I sat in uneasy silence. She fidgeted with the edge of the blanket, her gaze darting between me and the playground. Thanks for coming, she said finally, her voice so soft I almost didn't hear her. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I watched the kids, my heart clenching at how carefree they seemed. They didn't know how fragile everything was, how close their world had come to shattering completely. I didn't do it for you, I said finally, my tone flat. Lisa nodded, her shoulders sagging slightly. I know. But still. I'm glad you're here. For the next hour, we barely spoke. Lisa stayed close to the blanket, occasionally calling out to the kids, while I wandered around the park. I found a bench near the edge of the playground and sat down, letting the sounds of laughter and distant chatter wash over me. I watched Emma climb onto the monkey bars, her little legs swinging as she tried to reach the next rung. Careful, sweetheart, I called out, and she grinned at me, her confidence unwavering. Lisa approached a few minutes later, holding 2 ice-cold bottles of water. She handed one to me without a word and sat down on the opposite end of the bench. I miss this, she said quietly, her eyes on the kids. What? Watching them play? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She hesitated, then nodded. That and us. Being a family. Being happy. I took a long sip of water, letting her words hang in the air. It's going to take more than one trip to the park to fix this, I said finally. I know, she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly. I don't expect it to. I want to start somewhere. I didn't reply. Instead, I stood and walked back toward the blanket, leaving her sitting alone on the bench. The drive home was quieter than the drive there. The kids were exhausted, their energy drained from hours of running around. Emma fell asleep before we even left the parking lot, her head resting on her brother's shoulder. Lisa glanced at me as I pulled into the driveway. Do you think they had fun? She asked, her voice tentative. They seemed to, I said, cutting the engine. She opened her door but didn't get out right away. I know this doesn't mean things are better, she said softly. But thank you for giving today a chance. I didn't answer, just grabbed the kids' bags from the trunk and carried them inside. That night, after the kids were tucked in, Lisa appeared in the living room, holding a mug of tea. She hovered near the doorway for a moment before speaking. Can we talk? She asked, her voice hesitant. I sighed, setting down the remote. About what? About us, she said, stepping inside and sitting down across from me. I leaned back, crossing my arms. What about us? She set the mug on the coffee table and clasped her hands together. I know I can't undo what I did. And I know I can't expect you to forgive me, but I just want you to know I'm not giving up. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Even if it takes years. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I could see tears brimming in her eyes. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I don't know if that's enough, Lisa. I don't even know if I want this to work. Part of me wants to try, but another part of me thinks it's hopeless. I'll take that part of you that wants to try, she said quickly, leaning forward. Even if it's just a small part. I'll take it, and I'll work with it. Just don't shut me out completely." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Finally, I nodded, more out of exhaustion than agreement. "We'll see," I said quietly. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even hope. But it was something. By the time our second counseling session came around, the air between Lisa and me felt less suffocating but no less tense. We hadn't talked much since the park trip. Lisa seemed to be giving me space, while I tried to sort through my emotions, though it felt like trying to untangle 100 knots with no clear starting point. When Friday evening rolled around, I found myself standing outside the counselor's office again. Lisa arrived a minute later, her face lighting up with relief when she saw me. "You came," she said softly. "Let's just get this over with," I replied, walking past her into the building. Dr. Carver greeted us with the same warm smile, though her eyes seemed to study us more carefully this time. She motioned for us to sit down, and once we were settled, she got straight to the point. "Last week, we talked about the immediate fallout of what happened," she began, looking at both of us in turn. "This week, I want to focus on the deeper issues, the patterns and dynamics in your marriage that may have contributed to this situation." Lisa flinched slightly at the word "contributed," but I didn't say anything. I wasn't about to let her off the hook by pretending this was some shared failing. Dr. Carver turned to Lisa first. "Let's start with you. Can you tell me more about how you were feeling before the affair began? What was going through your mind?" Lisa hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. I was unhappy," she said finally. "Not all the time, but enough that it felt like something was missing. Nate was always working late, and when he was home, he was distant. I didn't know how to talk to him about it without feeling like I was nagging or ungrateful." I opened my mouth to respond, but Dr. Carver held up a hand, signaling for me to wait. Lisa continued, her voice trembling. "When I met Scott, it wasn't like I set out to cheat. At first, it was just nice to have someone to talk to, someone who made me feel seen. But then it crossed a line, and I didn't stop it. I should have, but I didn't. And I hate myself for that." Dr. Carver nodded, jotting something down on her clipboard before turning to me. "Nate, how do you feel hearing that?" "How do I feel?" I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "I feel like she's making excuses. She was unhappy, so she found someone else? How is that supposed to make me feel better?" "It's not about making you feel better," Dr. Carver said calmly. "It's about understanding what led to this point. That doesn't mean excusing her actions." I let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing my temples. "Fine. She was unhappy. I get that. But what about me? I was working long hours to support our family. I was doing my best, and apparently, that wasn't enough." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't about you not being enough," she said quickly. "It was about me not knowing how to handle how I felt. I should have come to you. I know that now. But you didn't," I shot back. "You went to him instead. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? Knowing my wife turned to someone else because I wasn't good enough? That's not what I'm saying." Lisa's voice cracked, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Dr. Carver stepped in before I could say anything else. "Let's take a breath," she said gently. "This is painful for both of you, but it's important to remember that you're here because you both want to try. Let's focus on that." I leaned back, exhaling slowly, trying to rein in the anger simmering just below the surface. "Lisa," Dr. Carver said, her tone soft but firm. "You've acknowledged that your actions hurt Nate deeply, and you've taken responsibility for them. But now, I want you to think about what needs to change moving forward. What can you do to rebuild trust and show Nate that you're committed to this marriage?" Lisa wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, her voice steadying. "I'll be honest, even when it's hard. I'll go to counseling, work on myself, and give Nate as much time as he needs. I know I can't erase what I did, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right if he'll let me. Dr. Carver nodded and turned to me. Nate, rebuilding trust is a two-way street. While it's Lisa's responsibility to prove herself, it's also important for you to communicate what you need from her. What does rebuilding trust look like for you? I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. I don't know, I admitted. I guess I need transparency. No more secrets, no more lies. And I need to feel like she's actually putting in the effort, not just saying she is. That's a good start, Dr. Carver said, smiling slightly. It's going to be a long process, and there will be setbacks. But the fact that you're both here, willing to have these conversations, is a step in the right direction. The session ended with Dr. Carver assigning us another round of homework, a list of boundaries and goals for our relationship moving forward. Lisa thanked her again as we left, her voice small and tentative. On the drive home, the silence between us felt less hostile than it had in weeks. Lisa glanced at me a few times, like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. When we pulled into the driveway, she finally spoke. I meant what I said in there, she said quietly. I'll do whatever it takes, Nate. Just tell me what you need. I looked at her, seeing the raw vulnerability in her eyes. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to lash out. I don't know what I need yet, I said honestly. But I'll let you know when I figure it out. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and she nodded. That's all I can ask. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself replaying the session in my head. For the first time in a long time, the anger wasn't the only thing I felt. There was still hurt, still doubt, but underneath it all, there was a tiny flicker of something else. Maybe it was hope. Over the next few days, I spent more time thinking about Dr. Carver's question than I cared to admit. What did rebuilding trust look like for me? It wasn't something I'd ever considered before because, honestly, I'd never imagined being in this situation. Trust had always been a given in our relationship, a foundation so solid I never thought to question it. And now? It felt like I was trying to build a house on sand. Lisa was doing her part, or at least trying to. She started leaving her phone on the counter instead of keeping it in her pocket or taking it to the bathroom like she used to. She offered to show me her messages and emails, though I hadn't asked. It felt performative, but at the same time, it was something. One night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the blank page Dr. Carver had asked us to fill with our boundaries and goals. Lisa sat across from me, nervously chewing on her thumbnail as she worked on her own list. The only sounds were the ticking of the kitchen clock and the occasional scrape of her pen on paper. After what felt like an eternity, she set her pen down and looked up at me. Done, she said softly, sliding her paper across the table. I hesitated, then picked it up, my eyes scanning the neatly written lines. Full transparency. No secrets, no hidden conversations. Honesty, even when it's hard. Weekly check-ins to talk about how we're feeling. Commitment to therapy, both together and individually. Patience with each other as we navigate this process. I read the list twice, trying to gauge how I felt about it. On the surface, it seemed reasonable. But the deeper I thought about it, the more cynical I felt. Words were easy. Following through on them was another story entirely. Do you mean this? I asked, my voice flat. Lisa nodded quickly, her eyes wide and earnest. Yes. Every word. I set her paper down and picked up my pen. All right, I said, writing slowly, deliberately. After a few minutes, I pushed my list across the table. She hesitated before picking it up, her hands trembling slightly. No contact with Scott. Ever. Complete honesty, no exceptions. If I catch you in another lie, it's over. Therapy until I say otherwise. No alone time. If you're out, I want to know where you are and who you're with. Respect my space. If I need distance, give it to me. Lisa read the list carefully, her expression shifting with each point. When she finished, she set it down and looked up at me. This is strict, she said cautiously. You wanted boundaries, I replied. Those are mine. Take them or leave them. She nodded slowly, her face pale but determined. I'll take them. Whatever it takes. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our agreement settling over us. This isn't going to be easy, I said finally, my voice softer now. I know, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm willing to try. Are you? I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure I had an answer. But eventually I nodded. I'm here, aren't I? That seemed to be enough for her. The following week, we started implementing the boundaries. Lisa deleted Scott's number in front of me, blocking him on every platform I could think of. She kept her phone face up on the counter, left the door open when she worked in the guest room, and updated me whenever she left the house. At first, it felt ridiculous, like some sort of parole agreement. But slowly, I realized it wasn't about controlling her, it was about rebuilding my sense of safety. And for the first time since this whole mess began, I started to feel like maybe that was possible. The weekly check-ins were the hardest part. Sitting down to talk about our feelings felt forced and awkward, especially at first. But Dr. Carver insisted they were crucial, and Lisa seemed committed to making them work. One night, during one of these check-ins, Lisa surprised me. I miss you, she said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. I looked up from my glass of water, frowning slightly. What do you mean? I'm right here. She shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. Not like this. I miss us. The way we used to talk, the way we used to laugh. I miss the way you used to look at me, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to snap back, to remind her that she was the one who ruined all of that. But instead I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I don't know if we can ever get back to that, I admitted. Lisa wiped her eyes, nodding slowly. I know. But I hope we can find something close. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the immediate urge to shut her out. We'll see, I said. It wasn't much. But for now, it was enough. Weeks turned into a month, and the routines we'd established started to feel less like obligations and more like part of our lives. Lisa was consistent, transparent with her whereabouts, honest during our check-ins, and fully engaged during therapy sessions. She was doing everything right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the trust between us was a delicate thread, frayed and ready to snap at any moment. One night, we sat across from each other in the living room, the silence stretching between us like a canyon. The kids had gone to bed, and Lisa was thumbing through a book while I half-watched a game on TV. I wasn't really paying attention, though. My mind was spinning, caught between the small progress we'd made and the mountain we still had to climb. Do you ever think we can get past this? I asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Lisa looked up from her book, startled by the question. I hope so, she said after a pause. But I don't know. Do you? I shrugged, picking at the edge of the couch cushion. Some days it feels possible. Other days it doesn't. Like I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. She set her book down and leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. There is no other shoe, she said firmly. I'm done with Scott. I've told you everything. I'm trying, Nate. I really am. I know you are, I admitted. And I can see that. But knowing it and believing it are two different things. Her face softened, and she nodded. I get that. I don't expect you to believe me overnight. I just... She hesitated, her voice trembling slightly. I just hope you can see that I'm not the same person I was when this started. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. I do see it. I'm just scared it's not enough. The weight of my words hung in the air, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Finally, Lisa broke the silence. Can I ask you something? She said cautiously. Sure. Do you still love me? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked at her, her face open and vulnerable, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the urge to shut her out. I don't know, I said honestly. Some days I think I do. Other days, I'm not so sure. She nodded slowly, tears brimming in her eyes. "Thank you for being honest," she whispered. We sat there in silence for a long time after that, the only sound the faint hum of the TV. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it wasn't unbearable either. The next day, I found myself thinking about her question more than I wanted to. Did I still love her? It wasn't a simple yes or no. The betrayal had left scars, but the memories of who we used to be, of the good times, still lingered, refusing to let go entirely. That evening, after the kids were in bed, Lisa came into the kitchen while I was cleaning up. "I wanted to show you something," she said nervously, holding her phone out to me. I frowned, wiping my hands on a towel before taking it from her. On the screen was an email thread between her and Dr. Carver. They'd been exchanging messages about additional therapy sessions Lisa could do on her own, focused on rebuilding trust and addressing the root causes of her actions. "I know I've hurt you," Lisa said quietly. "And I know I have a lot to work on. But I want you to know I'm taking this seriously. I'm not just saying the words, I'm putting in the work." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. It wasn't what I expected, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a small crack in the ice around my heart. "Thanks for showing me this," I said finally, handing her phone back. She nodded, her face softening with relief. "I just want you to know I'm trying, Nate. Not just for you, but for me too." That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange sense of calm. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't trust, not yet. But it was something. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like maybe that something could grow into more. The next therapy session felt different, almost like a turning point. Lisa and I walked in together, not in silence, but not exactly chatting either. The air between us was less charged, less hostile. Dr. Carver noticed immediately, her warm smile lingering as she welcomed us. "So," she began, settling into her chair, "how are things at home? Have the boundaries and check-ins been helpful?" Lisa spoke first. "I think so," she said, glancing at me. "It hasn't been easy, but I feel like we're making progress. Slowly." I nodded, keeping my gaze on the floor. "The boundaries help," I admitted. "At least it gives me a sense of control. But I'm still hesitant. It's hard to just let go of everything that's happened." "That's completely understandable," Dr. Carver said. "Rebuilding trust is a gradual process. It's about consistency over time. Nate, have you noticed any changes in how you feel toward Lisa since we started?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I guess I'm less angry," I said cautiously. "But it's not gone. The hurt is still there. I don't know if it'll ever go away completely." Dr. Carver nodded. "That's normal. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean the pain disappears entirely. It means learning how to live with it in a way that doesn't control you." Lisa reached for a tissue, dabbing at her eyes. "I don't expect him to forget," she said softly. "And I don't expect him to fully trust me anytime soon. I want him to know I'm here for the long haul. That I'll keep showing up, no matter how hard it gets." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to shut her out. Dr. Carver leaned forward, her tone gentle but firm. "It sounds like you're both committed to making this work, despite the challenges. But I want to stress the importance of shared effort. Lisa, you're taking responsibility for your actions, which is crucial. And Nate, your willingness to engage in this process shows that you haven't given up. That's significant." I nodded, though I wasn't sure how significant it really felt. The session ended with a new assignment, a list of things we appreciated about each other, past or present. We were supposed to write it separately, and share it at our next session. The idea seemed simple enough, but as I sat at the kitchen table later that night, staring at the blank sheet of paper in front of me, I realized how difficult it was. What did I appreciate about Lisa now? Did I appreciate anything? Eventually, I started with the past. She always made me laugh, even when I had a bad day. She's a great mom, patient, loving, and fiercely protective of our kids. She used to leave me little notes in my lunch when I worked late, just to remind me she was thinking of me. The memories came in slow, bittersweet waves. Each one hurt, but they also reminded me of who Lisa had been before everything fell apart. When I was done, I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket. I wasn't ready to share it yet, but just writing it felt like a small step forward. The next evening, Lisa approached me with her own folded piece of paper. "I finished my list," she said nervously. "I thought maybe we could trade now instead of waiting for the next session." I hesitated, then nodded. "All right." We sat across from each other at the dining table, exchanging papers without a word. My heart pounded as I unfolded hers, the neat handwriting jumping out at me. He's the hardest working person I know. He has the most amazing way of making our kids feel safe and loved. He made me feel like the most important person in the world when we first started dating. He's funny, even when he doesn't realize it. He's strong, stronger than I deserve. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening as I read her words. They felt honest, unguarded, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something close to warmth. When I looked up, Lisa was staring at me, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said softly, "for sharing your list. It means a lot." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Yours was nice too." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "We're not there yet, are we?" "No," I admitted. "But maybe we're getting closer." She reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. I didn't pull away, but I didn't take it either. We sat there like that for a long time, the silence between us no longer feeling like a wall, but a bridge we were starting to build. After we exchanged our lists, something shifted between us. It wasn't dramatic or even particularly noticeable at first, just a subtle softening of the tension that had hung over us like a storm cloud for weeks. Lisa didn't press me to talk more than I was ready to, and I found myself being less guarded, letting her back in piece by piece. The kids noticed it too. Emma, in her usual blunt way, asked me one morning at breakfast, "Are you and Mommy friends again?" I almost choked on my coffee. We're working on it," I said, glancing at Lisa, who was sitting across from me, her face carefully neutral. Emma beamed, clearly satisfied with that answer, and went back to eating her cereal. Lisa caught my eye and gave me a small, tentative smile. It wasn't much, but it felt like a truce. That week, during one of our check-ins, Lisa surprised me by bringing up something I hadn't expected her to. "I've been thinking about Scott," she said, her voice cautious but steady. I stiffened immediately, the name alone enough to make my stomach turn. "What about him?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I realized I'd been avoiding talking about him because I didn't want to upset you. But I think that's part of the problem. I can't just pretend he didn't exist. That's not fair to you." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to shut the conversation down, to tell her I didn't want to hear his name ever again. But another part of me, one I wasn't entirely comfortable acknowledging, appreciated her honesty. "What are you trying to say?" I asked finally. Lisa took a deep breath, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't want there to be any more secrets. If you have questions about what happened, I'll answer them. I'll tell you whatever you want to know, even if it's hard." My chest tightened at her words. I wasn't sure if I wanted to know more or if I could even handle hearing it, but the fact that she was offering, openly, without hesitation, meant something. I took a long sip of water, stalling as I tried to sort through the whirlwind of emotions her words stirred up. "I'll think about it," I said finally. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Okay. Take your time." That night, I found myself lying awake, replaying her words in my head. Did I want to ask her questions? Did I even want to know the answers? I'd spent so much time avoiding the details, afraid they'd only make the pain worse. But now, I wasn't so sure. The next day, I brought it up during our therapy session. "I'm torn," I admitted, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. "Part of me wants to know everything. The other part doesn't." Dr. Carver nodded thoughtfully. That's a common feeling in situations like this. The need for clarity can be overwhelming, but it's important to recognize your limits. There's no right or wrong choice here, only what feels right for you. Lisa spoke up then, her voice tentative. I just want Nate to know he can ask me anything. I don't want to hide anymore. Her words were genuine, but they also felt like a challenge, one I wasn't sure I was ready to face. That evening, after we put the kids to bed, Lisa approached me in the kitchen. Have you thought about what we talked about earlier? She asked, her tone gentle. I nodded, setting my glass of water down on the counter. Yeah. I've thought about it. And? I exhaled slowly, leaning against the counter. I want to know, why? Why him? Out of all the people in the world, why did it have to be him? Lisa's face crumpled, and she gripped the edge of the counter for support. I don't have a good answer for that, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't about him, Nate. It was about me. About feeling lost and stupidly thinking that someone else could fill the void I was feeling. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my anger in check. So he was just convenient. Is that what you're saying? No, she said quickly, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't like that. I wasn't thinking clearly, and I let myself believe lies I told myself about what I needed. I know that doesn't excuse it, but it's the truth. Her words hung in the air, and I couldn't decide if they made me feel better or worse. I'll never understand it, I said finally, my voice cracking. How you could throw away everything we had for him. Lisa sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. I don't understand it either. I wish I could go back and erase it, but I can't. All I can do is be better moving forward. I nodded, my jaw tight. I need some air, I muttered, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a slap, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm raging inside me. I paced the driveway, running a hand through my hair, trying to process everything. Her honesty was brutal, but it was also what I'd asked for. And for the first time, I realized that if we wanted to move forward, I had to stop running from the pain and start confronting it. When I finally went back inside, Lisa was sitting on the couch, her face streaked with tears. She looked up at me, her expression raw and vulnerable. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I sat down across from her, my hands resting on my knees. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, I said honestly. I'll wait, she replied, her voice trembling. For as long as it takes. For the first time, I believed her. The weeks following our conversation about Scott felt like walking a tightrope. There were moments of progress, little victories that felt like steps in the right direction, but they were always tempered by the weight of what still loomed between us. Lisa continued her therapy, both individually and with me. She made good on her promise to be transparent, answering my questions honestly, even when the answers hurt. And they did hurt. Every word felt like reopening a wound, but there was also something cathartic about it. The truth, as painful as it was, cleared away the fog of uncertainty that had been choking me for months. But forgiveness? That still felt miles away. One night, as we sat in the living room after another quiet dinner, Lisa turned to me, her expression hesitant. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead, I replied cautiously. Do you think we'll ever be okay again? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. I thought about the woman I'd married, the one who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt, the one who left silly love notes in my lunchbox when I worked late shifts. I thought about the betrayal, the lies, the heartbreak. I don't know, I said finally. I want to believe we can, but it's going to take time. A lot of time. Lisa nodded, her eyes glistening. I'll wait, she said softly. For as long as it takes. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about forgiveness. What did it even mean? Was it letting go of the pain? Accepting what happened and moving forward? Or was it something deeper, choosing to let love outweigh anger? The next day, During our therapy session, I brought it up. I don't know how to forgive her. I admitted, my voice raw. I don't even know where to start. Dr. Carver leaned forward, her tone gentle. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or condoning what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of anger and resentment. It's a process, Nate, not a single moment. But what if I'm not ready? I asked. Then you're not ready, she said simply. And that's okay. Forgiveness isn't something you can force. It has to come naturally, when you're truly prepared to let go. Lisa sat quietly beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I don't expect you to forgive me right now, she said. Or even soon. I hope that one day, you'll feel like it's possible. Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. A few nights later, I found myself in the kitchen, staring at the list of boundaries we'd written weeks ago. Most of them were still in place, but I realized something. Lisa had stuck to every single one of them without faltering. She had earned some of the trust she'd lost, not all of it, but enough for me to feel like maybe, just maybe, forgiveness wasn't as impossible as it had once seemed. The next morning, as we sat at the breakfast table, I cleared my throat. I've been thinking, I said, breaking the silence. Lisa looked up, her expression cautious. About what? About forgiveness, I said slowly. I'm not there yet. But I think I'm ready to take the first step. Her eyes widened, tears pooling as she set her coffee down. What does that mean? It means I'm willing to try, I said. To start letting go of some of the anger. To stop punishing you for something you can't undo. Lisa's face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hands, sobbing quietly. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea how much that means to me. It's not a pass, I said firmly. And it doesn't mean everything's okay. But it's a start. She nodded, her tears streaming freely. I understand. I'll take whatever you're willing to give. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of relief. The anger wasn't gone. It would take more time than I could imagine to fully release it, but it felt lighter, less all-consuming. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just for Lisa. It was for me too. The first step toward forgiveness was harder than I expected. Saying the words, even to myself, felt like letting go of a shield I'd been carrying since the moment I discovered Lisa's betrayal. That shield had protected me, kept me distant, safe from more pain. Without it, I felt vulnerable, exposed. But I also felt lighter. Lisa noticed the change immediately. It wasn't dramatic, no grand gestures or sudden warmth. But I wasn't as sharp with my words, and I found myself engaging in conversations that didn't revolve around our marriage or her mistakes. It was like we were rediscovering the basic act of coexisting, one small step at a time. One evening, I came home to find her in the backyard, helping the kids set up a tent. Emma was running circles around her brother, laughing uncontrollably, while Lisa knelt on the grass, trying to figure out the tangled mess of poles and fabric. You're doing it wrong, Emma teased, sticking her tongue out. No, I'm not, Lisa replied, laughing as she swatted at her. You just don't know how to read instructions. The scene was so normal, so reminiscent of who we used to be as a family, that it stopped me in my tracks. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a flicker of hope, not just for Lisa and me, but for all of us. Need help? I called out, walking over. Lisa looked up, surprised, but quickly smiled. You volunteering to read the instructions? Someone has to, I said, smirking as I grabbed the crumpled paper from her hands. The kids cheered as I took over, and for the next hour, we worked together to set up the tent. By the time it was done, the sun had set, and the backyard was bathed in a warm, golden glow. As we sat around the tent, roasting marshmallows over a small fire pit, Lisa leaned toward me and whispered, Thank you? For what? I asked, keeping my voice low so the kids wouldn't hear. For being here, she said softly. For this. I didn't respond, but I gave her a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was all I could offer in that moment. Later that night, after the kids had fallen asleep in the tent, Lisa and I sat together on the patio, sipping coffee. The silence between us felt different, less heavy, more comfortable. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Carver said," Lisa began, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug. "About how healing isn't linear. Some days it feels like we're making progress, and other days I worry I'll never earn your trust back. It's not about one moment," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "It's about all the little ones. The consistency. That's what matters." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'll keep showing up, Nate. For you, for the kids, for us. Even if it takes the rest of my life." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't looking at a stranger. There were still cracks in the foundation, deep ones, but maybe, just maybe, they weren't irreparable. "I know," I said finally. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be setbacks, doubts, and moments when the weight of everything felt unbearable. But for the first time, I felt like we were moving forward, not just standing still. As we sat there under the stars, the quiet of the night wrapping around us, I realized something: forgiveness wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one we'd have to walk together, step by fragile step. And for the first time, I felt ready to try.